Hello, and welcome to this year's first Schul Conversation. My name is Lori Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute and the Charlotte Regional Data Trust, and a faculty member in our School of Social Work. The Schul Forum Series was established in 2019 with an endowed gift from two longtime supporters of the university, alumna Marianne Schul and her husband Norm, who served as the Urban Institute's founding director in 1969. The Schuls have long believed in the Institute's power to bring the Charlotte region together and dialogue around important issues, especially when that dialogue is informed by research taking place here at the Institute and UNC Charlotte. Many thanks to the Schuls for their generous support. I would also like to recognize the Gambrell Foundation as a key part of the Schul Forum Series as well. The Gambrell Foundation has made a multi-year commitment to support research at the Institute, mainly through the Gambrell Faculty Fellows Program, which funds faculty research on economic mobility to benefit our Charlotte region. They have now funded 44 different scholars across all of our academic colleges. And with these online conversations, we're pleased to highlight some of the Gambrell's Fellows' work alongside local and national leaders. This year, we're excited to wrap our programming around a campus visit on November 14th by Dr. Ross Chetty, which will be available to the public on live stream. In 2014, research by Dr. Chetty and his team held up a mirror for Charlotte, fueling over a decade of work across sectors to improve economic prosperity for those born into our lowest income families. Some of the Chetty's team's latest work on social capital and economic connectedness has also captured our attention, and that's what we're focused on for this year's Schul Forum Series. In 2020, the Chetty team published findings from research that examined over 21 billion friendships from anonymized Facebook data, finding that one, and probably not so surprisingly, our social networks are highly segregated by income. But two, in the communities where people connect across class, low-income children are much more likely to rise out of poverty. But there are some caveats to what makes our communities and the places we gather work for shared economic prosperity. Depending on the setting, people are more or less likely to connect across class. Through the Schul Forum Series, we'll dig deeper into these connecting places, starting today with the places we live, our housing and our neighborhoods. And in 2 weeks, on November 9th, we'll dig deeper into the arts and our creative spaces. You can register for that conversation now with a link in the chat. But now, let's turn our attention to this Schul conversation. I am stepping in for Dr. Byron White, our Associate Provost for Urban Research and Community Engagement, who couldn't join us today because of a death in his family. Our thoughts are with him and are with you, Byron. Thank you. So, what is it that makes some of our connecting spaces work better at lifting children out of poverty than others? I'm really pleased to lead the conversation today on economic connectedness in mixed income communities and place-based initiatives. It was this form of social capital, economic connectedness, or what we've called bridging social capital, not social cohesion or civic engagement, that volunteer work, that led to greater rates of economic mobility in the Chetty team's work. Even when controlling for racial segregation and concentrated poverty, cross-class connections were strongly correlated to upward mobility, suggesting that the way we've structured segregation and concentration by race and poverty impede a key path to economic prosperity. When the Chetty team looked at the places that people were connecting, they found that some places were better at fostering these cross-class relationships. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the places we live, our housing, our neighborhoods were one of the places where low-income people are less likely to connect with people with higher incomes. And even among the places, those neighborhoods through new purposeful development or even gentrification that seem quite diverse, people are not connecting as much across class as they are in other settings, like our places of worship. But the implications of this and the oversimplification of this are worth discussing. Is it as simple as putting poor people beside rich people in our neighborhoods and in housing? And haven't we done that before? How is racial segregation still relevant when we're talking so much about class? We're going to jump into this today, and I'm so pleased to introduce the guests that will help us. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the guests, and they'll say a few opening comments, and we'll do one round that way, and then we'll jump into a larger conversation. So I'd like to first start by introducing Dr. Mark Joseph. Dr. Joseph is the Leona Bevis Marguerite Heyman Professor in Community Development at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. And really pertinent to this conversation, he is the founding director of the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities, also at Case Western Reserve. And I will note that we all agreed to use first names in this panel conversation. So Mark, thank you so much for being here. And can you briefly define mixed income communities for us, and just maybe why you founded the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities?
Sure thing, Lori, and it's wonderful to be with you and with all your guests. We're so excited everyone's taken time to join us here at midday for this really important conversation. So when we think about mixed income communities or mixed income housing or mixed income development, I think what's really intended by that is intentionally trying to go against the grain. As you've been saying already, the tendency in our society and in our cities is towards segregation. Racial segregation, economic segregation, we tend to live apart. And so mixed income communities are really a policy that's been around for a couple decades now in the US and really around the world to intentionally design housing and finance housing and then create communities around it that are going to be home to a mix of incomes. And so, as I said, this policy has been around for quite a while. The reason we started the center is because we realized that there was an emerging body of work going on, but there hadn't been a lot of research that talked about why this was a good idea. We knew as a society that we didn't necessarily like the status quo, but we didn't necessarily know that creating these mixed income communities were going to get us where we wanted to. So we started the center almost exactly 10 years ago. We celebrate our 10th anniversary on November 7th to kind of be a go-to place. So we really appreciate being part of the conversation today because we've spent several years now studying this question in cities around the country, again, and around the world, working alongside developers, property managers, planners to try to implement their strategies, and then really trying to network folks to learn from what the best practices are and the emerging knowledge across cities. So good to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Having worked in a community development corporation about 25 years ago now, and knowing that that kind of intentional conversation was often lacking. It's great to hear, learn more of your center and have you featured here today. So thank you so much, Mark. Our next guest, Julie Porter, is the executive director of DreamKey Partners, one of the leading developers of mixed income housing in our region. Julie, thank you for joining us. And tell us about the work of DreamKey Partners in Charlotte, and particularly, you have a huge portfolio, your mixed income housing development efforts.
Yeah, a little bit about DreamKey. We are a nonprofit organization. We've been working in the Charlotte region for over 30 years now. And our intent, the intent of DreamKey starting was really to rebuild a community that had been demolished due to urban renewal. And so we had our start in kind of almost a racial justice type of environment. But really that led us to a very place-based initiative called, the Statesville Avenue Corridor. And we have been working there ever since. So we started in the Greenville neighborhood. We went just across the street over at Park at Oaklawn and Genesis Park. We're working in the Druid Hills neighborhood on the other side of Statesville. And of course, we developed a planned community called Bright Walk, which now has probably over 800 units, and it is entirely mixed income. So it has been quite an experience. We have learned a lot. And we've learned a lot about community engagement. I mean, Lori, what we have found is if you are not intentional about that community engagement, you will continue to have those separations. And it has been very difficult, but when you actually set it up so that there are events and reasons for people to get together and interact, it actually works. But you do have to have comprehensive strategies around that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Julie. I know we're going to hear a whole lot more about that throughout this conversation. So our next guest, Dr. Andrew Case, is an associate professor of psychological sciences here at UNC Charlotte, where he co-coordinates the community psychology concentration. He is a current Gambrell Fellow with his co-investigator, Dr. Sharon Watson, focusing on measuring effectiveness in place-based initiatives. Andrew, thank you for joining us. And will you, to kind of get started, give us a quick definition of a place-based initiative and briefly discuss the work that you, Dr. Watson, and other colleagues are doing in place-based initiatives here in Charlotte.
Sure. Thank you, Lori, for the invitation to be a part of such an esteemed panel. I will try to be brief in my definition. I don't know how successful that will be. I think it's helpful to talk about place-based initiatives or approaches, as they're sometimes referred to, across three domains or three types of definitions. The goal, the strategy, and the mode of intervention. So when we talk about place-based initiatives, what these efforts are focused on would be improving whole communities within a geographic area. So for example, a neighborhood. So it's not just focused on specific individuals who take part in a particular service or intervention, or focused on a particular problem like mental health or education. The whole idea is the uplift of an entire community. So that's the goal. So it's locale specific, and the idea is to target everyone within that specific locale. In terms of strategy, I would say that the approach is largely holistic and community level transformation. So there's often more than one type of intervention or more than one domain of community well-being that is being targeted. So it could be education, economic mobility, mental health, workforce development, etc. But it's looking at multiple domains of well-being in this holistic type of way. And the idea is for community transformation. So there's a targeting of the physical, social, economic conditions that affect people within a particular locale. And then in terms of interventions, as I mentioned, there are a number of things that can be targeted within place-based initiatives, and that can occur at multiple levels of analysis. So you could have things that are targeting individuals, such as, workforce development or career preparation. You could have programs that are focusing on families, around economic mobility, for example. And then there are things that could be more tailored to a community level. So getting, one of the panelists, or a couple of them so far, have talked about intentionality. So how do you get people talking, interacting, feeling a part of something greater? Mm-hmm. So these initiatives can be targeted at multiple levels, but the idea is that at the end of the day, as you're moving the needle on these specific domains of well-being, that there is this effect where the entire community is improving in some way. So that's my definition of place-based initiatives. And along with my colleague and fellow Gambrell fellow Sharon Watson, we're part of an interdisciplinary team of faculty and graduate student researchers called the Social Aspects of Health Initiative. And we are working with place-based initiatives in the Charlotte region to do two things. One is to understand the facilitators and barriers of success for place-based initiative, what seems to work and what seems to be challenges associated with the work that's being done, and then how can we help build capacity within these initiatives to evaluate their effectiveness over time.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate that. I know we're going to be hearing more about what you and colleagues have found. Our next guest is Tiffany Capers. And Tiffany is the Executive Director of CrossRoads Corporation for Affordable Housing and Community Development that anchors the place-based initiative in Greer Heights here in Charlotte. Welcome, Tiffany. And make sure you unmute yourself.
I just said the most profound, of course, while I was on mute. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. And thank you, Lori, for inviting me to be a part of the conversation today as well. It's appropriate that I just followed Andrew, as Greer Heights is a community that is the place that CrossRoads serves. CrossRoads is a place-based initiative. We're called the Community Quarterback. We're a nonprofit organization that serves the specific locale of the Greer Heights community in Charlotte. For those of you who are from Charlotte, you might be aware, or you might not be aware, that Greer Heights is a community that was founded by a former enslaved Black man by the name of Sam Billings. He was the first Black man in Mecklenburg County to acquire property, around 100 acres or so. And that land became known as Greer Town, Stumptown to some, but it's the Greer Heights community. Arthur Greer, one of the sons of the Greer Heights community, was a developer from the neighborhood, and he built the first 100 homes for soldiers returning from the war. He was the first developer in the community, and Greer Heights, I believe, if it's not the oldest, this is one of the oldest Black communities in Charlotte. So there's rich history in the community. There's much pride in the community with respect to where it has been. There are obviously concerns about what is happening in the community with degree of gentrification and development and revitalization is happening. So there are always conversations about who's here, who's coming, who can stay, who has to leave, and how we as an organization is trying to make sure that all those conversations are taking place and that we are respectful and respecting all the voices that we're hearing from the community. As Andrew mentioned, our approach definitely focuses on a social determinants of health lens. So we are focused on all aspects of the quality of life that our neighbors in Greer Heights deserve. So we try to facilitate programs and services, directly providing some and creating a network of nonprofit organizations to meet those needs.
Great, Tiffany, and I know we'll hear more. Thank you for being here. So let's go ahead and bring the whole panel in and really continue with this notion of mixed income. Our thoughts often go first to housing, since it's where we choose or are forced to live that segregates us by race and economic status. But the idea of mixed income communities goes beyond housing, as we've already heard today. So, Mark, I'm going to start with you again. You've already given us a description of mixed income communities. So where does housing fit in particularly in this time of housing scarcity?
Yeah, great place to start. And I love how you said our thoughts often go to housing when we think about mixed income communities and social mix, but it doesn't have to. So one thing I'll just put a pin in is we could be talking about schools. We could be talking about workplaces. Laura, you mentioned our faith institutions. So there's other places in society where we could be thinking about this challenge and opportunity of mix. But you're right, when we think about community development and we think about place-based initiatives, we often start with housing. But I really appreciate that Julie and Andrew have already used the words comprehensive and holistic. So we start with housing, but it's far more than just housing. Housing is really the platform. It's kind of the starting place. And that would be both in terms of how do you get a place redevelopment started? Often the bricks and mortar, the physical development is a place to start. But also it's a fundamental need, as you just said, of shelter, right? So it makes sense as a place to start. And so often that's what we do. And I would say the first thing in terms of then where housing fits is it is incredibly complex to just make that happen. We know there's a bunch of other things we need to get to, but just if we're talking about producing affordable housing, And we're talking about wrapping that within a community that's going to be a mixed income community. So we want affordable housing, maybe some very low income housing available to public housing families, and then also some market rate housing. That alone is a complicated endeavor. But I would say the good news is we have figured out over 20, 30 years as a field how to do it. Our challenge is not, I think, the technicalities of financing and producing affordable housing. I think it's the resources. And I think it's the pace and the scale. But beyond housing, at our center, we've come up with a 6-part elements of mixed income success, and I'll run through them very, very quickly. The first would be housing. We've got to build it, get it occupied, and get people into it. But then we want to think about the neighborhood, and we want to think about the community around the housing. So if you just redevelop the housing, but you're not intentional about what's going on around it and the amenities in that community, those who might not be living in the redeveloped housing, but living next to it, you haven't done the full pathway to success. Third, you want to think about avoiding displacement. This is a big one. And you've already used, I think, the G word, gentrification. And people often will think of a conversation about mixed income communities as really a conversation about gentrification, which then is really a conversation about displacement. Doesn't have to be. This is where we come back to the intentionality of how we do these processes and how we might avoid. But I would say this third element of success is avoiding displacement by income and by race. A fourth element of success is attraction, right? You want to attract a new set of folks into this community so that you can then make it a mixed income community and not only attract them, but retain them. Then we get to the last two hardest success factors. We're not just talking about building housing, we're talking about building a community within that housing. And so this is where we get into what's already been referenced about how do people connect with each other, often across very different lines of difference and background and challenges and opportunities in their lives. And then the final one, super important, and that really gets to the focus of the Schul Forum this year, is economic mobility. And so while we talk about this as a housing strategy or a community strategy, in our hearts and minds, what we really want to see is upward economic mobility. And so are we seeing this housing strategy translate into a different kind of trajectory for the families who are living there?
Yeah, that's great. And I know that we're going to catch so many more of these themes, but I really think you're even touching on some things that we're seeing in the questions that came in registration about the potential displacement of people who are in communities and the displacement of culture. And we will come back to that over and over during this series itself. But to jump on that, Julie, I'm going to turn to you because DreamKey Partners has been a leader in building mixed income residential developments in Charlotte. And you've already said you've learned a lot. So what have you learned through that experience to encourage people to live together over time, to build community? So it's not displacement, it's not segregated lives. What have you learned? What can you tell us?
Thanks, Lori. Well, first of all, I think when we started out in the Statesville Avenue corridor, the one thing that I think made a difference for us and probably set us out on the right foot was that we had a plan. It was a written plan, and it was community driven. So, I mean, we purposefully engaged the community that lived there and asked them what would improve the quality of life for their neighborhood. And I think when you do that, when you actually are making sure that our work, which is often in affordable housing and often building single family and multifamily housing, that it's reflective of what their goals are, not my goals. And so, and it touches on your gentrification issue, because we have also worked in the neighborhoods surrounding the Bright Walk neighborhood, which was the planned community. And our whole premise is you have to revitalize the neighborhood and not gentrify it, which just means you have to improve it for the people who already live there. And yes, you do want new people to move in and you want new energy in the neighborhood, but at the same time, if you are not reflecting their goals, and let me tell you something, we've worked not just on affordable housing, we've worked on park redevelopment, we've worked on transportation, wayfinding signs. When you're talking about community development, you're talking about comprehensive strategies. I think you really have to expand what you're willing to do, and you also have to partner. You can only do so much, and you have to be able to partner with others to bring things to the table. So I think that is one of the things that has worked for us, but the layering of strategies and having it be community driven are some of the most important.
Yes, thank you so much, Julie. And I do think so many concerns right now and so much emphasis on housing because really an unprecedented housing scarcity issue. But what what I think all of us are aware of, and if we've worked in the field at all for any amount of time, is this idea of creating mixed income housing is often portrayed as the magical solution to the housing crisis. And economic disparities. It really is a silver bullet kind of solution that people talk about a lot. But the idea of mixed income community seems rather elusive and very difficult to start and maintain. And so, Tiffany, I'd really like to talk to you to kind of deepen this a little bit as well. Like, can you talk about the deeper socioeconomic issues in communities such as Greer Heights that have to be addressed beyond just a housing strategy?
Absolutely. And this is such a nuanced conversation given what housing represents. And part of the conversation I think takes place in communities of color is why are our communities the only communities where mixed income housing seems to be the fit? I don't know that people are opposed philosophically or morally to everyone having a place to live, no matter where they might be situated on the area median income spectrum from 30% to 110%. But I think communities of color feel that they are bearing a disproportionate share of having mixed income housing in their communities because, as we know, homeownership is the American way to establish one's path to wealth. So there is this constant tension about where we can build affordable housing just because the land oftentimes is less expensive in communities of color. And we also know the land is sometimes less expensive in communities of color because of all the historical decisions we've made around housing in this community. So there are, as my grandmother would say, a lot of chickens that are coming home to roost at this point with respect to how do we solve for housing needs as we look for solutions to what might be the future. To your point about the socioeconomic issues, Lori, yes. I looked up a definition, if you will, of socioeconomic issues, and it said the socioeconomic issues include the ethics, fairness, and results of policies, theories, and institutions that may lead to different outcomes and opportunities based on income and background. Poverty in and of itself is a major socioeconomic issue. So if we're not addressing how people can gain access to workforce development programs, how they can gain access to livable wages, how they can even earn an income. I think in Charlotte, you probably have to make $55,000 a year to live comfortably in Charlotte. The median income for persons in Greer Heights is $18,000 a year. So addressing poverty and providing pathways for people to escape poverty is important. Other socioeconomic issues we have to address are health disparities, access to healthcare, outcomes when one accesses healthcare. The mortality rate for Black women who are pregnant is really different for other women who might be pregnant. So health disparities, low education levels, access to quality education, primary to secondary, and then pathways beyond that for persons who might not want to go to college or might not have received an education that they needed to prepare them for next step. The other issues around justice system, even inequalities with regards to the military. I know that Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy is doing a lot of work now around veterans who were dishonorably discharged for racially motivated reasons. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, and you see so many of our veterans who are also homeless. They can't access their VA benefits because they were dishonorably discharged. So the economic issues that we are facing are much very much integrated and very much tied together with race and our history in this country, and how we have to sort of, again, reckon with housing being a proxy for problems and potentially for some solutions.
Right, right. And so I want us to kind of begin to weave this together, but before we do, I would like to turn to Andrew for a second to kind of build off of this kind of socioeconomic features and really even think about the cultural elements of community and how those play in when we're actually trying to create communities that are mixed income. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure, happy to. So when we talk about housing, especially amid the affordable housing crisis, there's this intuitive sense around why housing is important at a basic level for shelter and protection. And beyond that, we know that it is a pathway for economic mobility. But there's also a psychological and social element of housing that I think sometimes gets overlooked. I'm thinking in particular about an essay that was written by the late, great Bell Hooks called Home Place as a Site of Resistance. And in it, she's speaking about the importance of the home within and speaking about her experiences, but within this larger context of racism and sexism, how home became this political place in which there is this sense of humanizing, the sense of what is possible for people to experience despite the larger injustices that they may experience. So there's this psychological and social importance around having home that sometimes I think gets overlooked. There's also this notion of attachment to place. So when we're talking about community, there's obviously the social element of it, but there's also this spatial connection that happens as well. And within human geography, there's been this really interesting demarcation between space and place, space being a spatial coordinate, right? If we think about coordinates, space represents a specific geographic location, and place is what space becomes once there is meaning and emotion attached to it. So over time, people come to identify with particular places, having lived in it, having developed relationships, having worked, played, worship in these places. There's this attachment that happens that then leads to a greater sense of investment. People want to have children here. People want to give back to this place. And so that's an important aspect too of community that I think connects to many of the things that we're interested in, such as economic mobility, but also the sense of community, the sense of being connected to people. And then there's a third piece of this that I'd like to highlight, and that is this sense of community. And I'll give a short story around this because I think it's illustrative. So my wife and I bought our first home in 2017. And this was a big deal, particularly for me, coming from a family where we rented our homes. It represented a certain amount of residential stability for my children that I did not experience growing up. And so we bought our home and we moved into the suburbs, so to speak. And I remember waiting after we moved in, waiting for someone to bring a casserole to our house and welcome us to the neighborhood, because that was my sense of community, having seen movies and various types of reproductions where people just brought casseroles to welcome you in. And, you know, that didn't happen. And it had me questioning, well, what is community, especially in this day and age? A little bit later on, I went to my first HOA meeting looking for community and found out, well, I don't think this is the place for community. They seem more interested in property values and so forth. And there was some disenchantment. But then, you know, I got on some of these neighborhood apps and realized that, you know, people were connecting in these places in ways that I didn't even think people would. People were putting out ideas. They were highlighting their services, doing volunteer work, all sorts of things. People had issues they would bring up and it would be addressed on these neighborhood apps. So I bring this up to highlight the fact that sense of community is important, but it's also dynamic and it changes over time. And I think we have to be aware of that social aspect of it. Like I have, and we all have our notions of community, but I think going back to Julie's point about connecting into the ideas and the goals of specific communities, we want to understand, well, what does community look like for the individuals who are actually living in these places that we are working with. So I think it's important to keep in mind the social and the psychological importance of home and community as we delve into these issues.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think you're spot on. And what I'd actually really like to do is come back to Mark for a second, because I really want to kind of address something that Tiffany said and kind of the thread that's been cast throughout around the nuance when we're talking about, particularly about race, racism, segregation, and you know, the way that we've structured our communities to operate this way, and the way that we've structured building wealth in this country. And Mark, what I'd love to ask, I think I'd love to hear some about the track record overall of mixed income communities doing this across the country. And but then I'd also like us to dig into just a little bit about the relevance of race in the Chetty work, even though we're talking about cross-class connections, because I think that's one of the oversimplifications I've heard of this work is that, oh, we can just connect across class. That's easier. And what I think I've heard from all of you here is this is the work, right? This is the real work. We don't want to displace this rich community in Greer Heights. These are places that people have created and formed attachments to. That's a part of well-being as well. So Mark, I'm just wondering if you can give us some texture there. Can you give us some texture and then give us maybe a larger picture nationally of how mixed income communities are doing with that texture?
Absolutely. I'll start on the texture with a little counter story to Andrew's story. So I'm one of those folks who will take the casserole. And so I had a neighbor move in right next to me, older white gentleman. He was a doctor at the local Cleveland clinic. And it was cookies. I went over and took him cookies at the door and knocked on his door, and he came out and he was perfectly pleasant. We kind of sat on his porch for a moment. He clearly was stunned to have someone come to his door. And the next day, he came back and knocked on my door and he said, "I'm so sorry that I didn't invite you in." And I was so thrown to have someone standing at my door. I didn't know it was out of practice. And so I think one piece of texture is, you know, have we forgotten how to neighbor? Have we forgotten how to connect with each other? And of course, COVID has made that even worse than it was before. It was already bad. But that becomes especially important because many of our viewers may say, well, I'm not knocking on my neighbor's doors. I'm not actually looking for anyone to knock on my door. So you guys are asking for something that I'm not even looking to do. But in a community that we are intentionally trying to promote this social bridging, like that's part of the mechanism, we have to lean into that. And I think part of our challenge is we've lost that skill. We've lost that ability. It's not natural to us. So I would really ask our viewers and those who are listening along with us to ask themselves about their own work in this, right? I think this is some of the muscle that we're all losing, all of us. We shy away from that interaction for many, many reasons. And some of them are more stark reasons of real safety. And I think this is where your question of race comes in, Lori. Because as a Black man who's now got to be more careful than I ever have, and it's even starker when I think about my children and my boys, and have to spend more time instructing them about caution in where they go and how they show up. And frankly, my wife today probably wouldn't allow them to go over and take the cookies to that neighbor. And she probably would let me go because she knows I'm hard-headed. But she probably would be very nervous until I came back. And this would be just across the street, right? I refuse to allow what's going on in our society to prevent me from neighboring, but that's really easy for me to say. I study and think about this stuff all the time. And so we add in a layer of race, how difficult it is for us to step across and do that bridging. So I think those of us working on this need to really be thinking even harder about how we facilitate it, how we give permission for it, how we train toward it, how we reward it when it happens. Very quickly to answer your question about the bigger picture. And again, we've had the privilege of looking across cities, across initiatives at this work. The record is very mixed in terms of these mixed income efforts turning into the economic mobility that we're hoping to see. For sure, there are some amazing stories, anecdotes of families who this was just the thing they were waiting for, and they were in a position and ready to take advantage of it. So there's no doubt we can see those stories. But when we start to want to see this at scale, when we start to want to ask questions about of a set of residents who were able to move, unfortunately, in many cases in these mixed income efforts, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing those families who are able to navigate all the hurdles to stay, not be displaced, still remaining in pretty tenuous economic circumstances.
Right.
And where there are surveys, for example, about food security, and have you run out of food before the end of the month? Amazingly, in these mixed income communities, still seeing low income households talking about food insecurity. And of course, listeners wouldn't be surprised, right? This is in the time of COVID where things have gotten even more difficult in these economic times. So we have a lot of work to do, but I will still come back to mixed income community building as a platform that should work. I don't think it's the wrong idea. I think we're just learning about the complexity of it, learning about the need to sustain it. And I love the earlier point, I think Julie made it and Tiffany as well, about the partners that are needed. And I would say it's about those partnerships and about getting those partners on the same page about what we're trying to create together. And we may come back to that point.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So I want to take the conversation. We're going to keep coming back to these themes, and I see relevant questions that are popping up in the chat too that we're going to try to get to, and that you all feel free to pepper in answers on that. But I really want to turn just a second to the Chetty team's work around finding their findings that even in economically diverse neighborhoods and schools, and I think this is what you're talking about, some of those mixed outcomes, but even in economically diverse neighborhoods and schools, the settings can foster a friending bias, or the tendency to limit the friendships to the people who are like you, the people you know, the people who you share community with already. And so, Tiffany, I'd like to turn back to you and really think about, how does that impede? And I think I'm connecting this to a couple of questions I'm seeing in the chat and in registration as well, about this concern about that the solution for low-income families is to move somewhere where there's more opportunity versus the staying space too. So I'm wondering if you can respond to you have long-term residents there that have some shared notion, not some, a lot of a shared notion of the community they want to preserve. And then this, the realization of the friendship bias that showed up in that Chetty work, and the necessity to create these kind of pathways out of the socioeconomic kind of things that you painted earlier. I wonder if you could speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I would absolutely say in the Greer Heights community, there is a sense of quote unquote othering by long-term residents. People have been in the community for a number of years, and there's this othering between renters and homeowners. Greer Heights is about 16% owner occupied, meaning the majority of the community consists of a rental population, either single family or multifamily housing. And so there is this notion of renters versus homeowners, if you will. There's a notion of this is our community, we're from Greer Town, Greer Heights is a novel, newer name for the community, and so there's this tension there. And I think to some extent, perhaps in fairness or defense of those who've been in the community for a long time, these spaces and places, oftentimes communities of color, were the communities that nobody else wanted. Nobody else wanted to be a part of. Nobody wanted to live there. Now that it's popular, because these communities are often proximate to the other amenities in cities, people want to now live in Greer Heights. They want to now live in Biddleville. They want to now live in, pick your community in the Crescent, if you will. So we want to live there. We want to live in Cherry. And I think there is my word, not there, some resentment around, well, why now? No, don't come in our community now, when we were making what we wanted to make with the scraps, if you will, that we were given from a variety of fill in the blank, socially, racially, economically. We made this community our home, and it's much beloved, and we don't want the other coming in. And this feeling really cuts across racial ethnic identity, because there are Black newcomers into Greer Heights that meet with the same sort of consternation as folks who've been there for 30 years. So yes, it is very much an issue in the community, and it has led to some interesting conversations around community voice and community consensus about what needs to come next, for sure.
Yeah. And Julie, as you well know, Charlotte, the country, an unprecedented housing availability and affordability crisis. Does the pressure to address that crisis sometimes obscure the need for this important community building work? And how is DreamKey even balancing those two things?
That is such a great question, because there's a part of us that just says we just need to build affordable housing. And that's why our place-based initiatives are so important. Because otherwise we're just going to be building, as Tiffany said, in low-income communities where the land is cheapest and we can actually get units on the ground. With the place-based initiative, and being able to work with the residents themselves, I think that that's the most rewarding of our work. But it doesn't mean that we can stop building affordable housing, because those communities are becoming gentrified. We see it as our job to make sure that they remain affordable to the degree we can. Things are changing really fast, as you know, in Charlotte and in some of these communities. And, we're worried, just frankly, that there comes a time, even in the Statesville Avenue corridor, when the housing that we have built is the only affordable housing. So it is a constant worry. And with the housing shortage overall, we're torn. We're torn in many different directions, because we are relied upon, as you know, in Charlotte to build affordable housing, among others. But if it's a hard one, lots of times we'll be the one who is doing it if it's in a tough location. And that sometimes feels like the priority is just getting units on the ground, because as Mark said, you really can't start economic opportunity if you don't have stable housing. It is really difficult for somebody to get ahead in life unless, they are absolutely comfortable with the roof over their head, because otherwise they're not thinking about anything else. And so, that's why lots of times these plans, even the comprehensive plan that we had with Statesville Avenue, yes, it had multiple layered strategies, but we started on affordable housing. The first 3 things we built were all affordable housing. And that's because that's what the community wanted. So I think this is the toughest balance we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Julie. Mark, in your research, what have you seen that helps? I think we're all aware of how much has to be built right now, and we're so in such a deficit around housing. But if we go back to thinking about that, overcoming the friending bias and not erasing community culture while we're building and all of that building that needs to happen, are there examples, maybe generally what's working there? And then are there examples of actually crafting economically diverse communities and preserving that fabric that makes the places and the groups unique?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. This is good. I mean, we've been talking about challenges and it's a little bit doom and gloom, but I think most of us we're at this because we're optimistic people and we know that we can do better. So it's a great opportunity to talk about what does work. Because I think part of it again is we do know some things to do. It's just, can we have the resources, the time, the focus to do them? So I believe we're going to put in the chat a link to my friends and colleagues at Trusted Space Partners. They're actually down there in North Carolina with you all, closer to the Durham area. And they are among some of the top kind of thinkers about community network building and have come up with a range of strategies and devices and activities that can be done to overcome this friending bias that people naturally want to stick with people like themselves. So I'm going to tell you two real quick. One is what they call Neighbor Up Night. And I think a little bit earlier, Julie mentioned about activities that bring people together, which is absolutely an important platform. You have to even have activities, but then often you find people come to the activity and then they want to hang out with the people they're comfortable with. It's natural. All of us would do that, walking into a strange environment. So Neighbor Up Night goes a couple steps further. Number one, it's something that happens, an event happens every month. So it becomes a little bit of a ritual. People can get used to it. People get a sense of how it flows. If you don't make it 1 month, you can come back the next month. So it's not a block club. It's not any other kind of association that often has leaders and everyone else. Another issue that we haven't mentioned, although Julie, I see in the chat, you talked about power sharing, is there can be an emergence of gatekeepers. A few folks who feel like they speak for the community. They speak for everyone else. No one can talk for this community unless you come through me. So Neighbor Up Night tries to avoid that. The chairs are set up in a circle. So no one is on a stage. No one is in a front. We're all in a circle. There's music playing. The room is colorful. It feels more like you're coming to a party than to a meeting. And it just is trying to lighten the mood. Very often community activities can be a bit heavy, especially if people are bringing some sense of friction or something they're upset about to the meeting. So you try to reduce that a little bit. This is about neighbors hanging out. And then there are three things that happen. One, the first thing is new and good. Going around the circle and allowing everyone to say something new or good that's happened in their life recently. And this does a few things. Number one, it gets every voice in the room. So very often in community meetings, there's a couple people talking and everyone else sitting there is like, I'm not going back. That person dominated the whole meeting. In this way, within the first 10, 15 minutes, everyone has spoken. And then secondly, it's new and good. You're being invited to say something positive. And it's amazing. Every time it happens, you hear about births and grades and someone getting over a health scare. And it just, again, makes people start to feel humanly connected to each other. The second part is what's called table talk. And the agenda comes from the meeting itself. And so in that meeting, it's asked, what would you like to talk about tonight? So this is, again, some power sharing where someone in the room can say, you know what, that's a stop sign at the corner there. People are ignoring it. I'd like to talk about how we get a speed bump put in. Someone else might say, you know what, I play chess. I'd love to talk about having a chess club. And on and on. And so then you might get 4 or 5 conversations, and then people can choose who they want to go talk with that evening. It's led by the room and by the group. It's also a nice way to avoid anyone dominating the whole room, is that you split up into these conversations so no one person can organize it. And then the final part is kind of my favorite part. It's called the marketplace. You get back in a circle. This time you go around and everyone either makes an offer, a request, or a declaration. And the idea of this is that we have the resources within our own community to support each other. And someone might say, I'd like to get started walking, but I need a walking buddy. Will someone walk with me? Or someone might say, you know what, my kid has outgrown their bike. It's sitting in my closet. Anyone want a bike for a 6-year-old? And it becomes an opportunity to connect. So again, what's at the heart of it is intentionality and permission to connect in a way that sadly, the reality is I think we need that permission and that forum that allows us to do so. The other quick thing I'll mention is Hospitality Covenant, which a group in Pittsburgh, if you're interested, look up Trek Development in Pittsburgh, TREK, and their Hospitality Covenant. It's a covenant that is signed by all of their staff members from CEO all the way out into the community. And it's got very simple things. Say hi to everyone you see. Make a positive greeting. Bring positivity into your community. Other things that they are going to agree to do on a daily basis. But then this hospitality covenant is also signed by residents in the community. So you have staff and residents committing explicitly to a certain kind of what we call operating culture as a way of, again, allowing and giving permission for a kind of shift in how people connect with each other. So there's lots more ideas if you all check out Trusted Space Partners, or certainly follow up with us and we can direct you in towards some of those.
Yeah, and Mark, what I would love to actually do, because I can actually hear, maybe I'm hearing thoughts in my head. I've been in academia long enough that I'm hearing the naysayers to what you just said, right? I'm hearing the this doesn't tackle the very real zoning issues that we have. This doesn't tackle the sticks and bricks. It doesn't tackle the shortage. Well, how would you respond to that? How would you respond to, and I know it's happening. There's a part of my head saying, but gosh, we just have to, people don't have places to live. So how would you respond to that? How would you respond to kind of skepticism to those kind of what might seem like touchy-feely solutions to really structural hard problems?
I love that. Thank you, Lori, so much. So here's how I'd respond. How do we solve those structural problems? How do we change policy? Where does policy come from? Policy comes from people. People making a decision, people proposing an idea, people voting for an idea, people standing behind an idea. So those people who make those decisions have a certain experience and mindset out of which they're making those. And because those people who are making those decisions haven't experienced a neighbor up night, they haven't experienced a hospitality covenant, they haven't lived in a mixed income community that works, they're then making policy that replicates the status quo. So to me, we can try and plead and beg for structural change, and we do need to try to mobilize for it. But at the same time, let's start creating experiences and places where people have a different experience. So then that'll change what they think is possible. We're at a place in our country we don't think it's possible. So why would we promote that kind of policy? Or we think that affordable housing is for a certain type of person who we then stigmatize and say, we don't want them in our community. But if we did the work to create the opportunities to actually meet folks at a different kind of level, then maybe that translates into folks who are willing to vote in a different way.
Right.
Who are willing to put up a different kind of legislation. So I think these touchy-feely things absolutely are at the core of why we're not willing to stand behind policies that actually might be beneficial to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, Andrew, I want to ask you, I'm going to shift just a little bit because I really want to get in. I've seen one question about measurement and really getting hard numbers. How are we measuring the impact of place-based initiatives, mixed income communities, and what is the role that researchers are playing? And then we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Sure, I can try to answer that. So there have been efforts to measure effectiveness in place-based initiatives and various review articles that have come out. And similar to, Mark noting that around the mixed income communities, there is some inconclusiveness in some of the report findings. We do see some similar things with place-based initiatives more broadly. I think part of the issue there is that, as Mark said, if you look, there are these really great stories and really great anecdotes and really great testimonials to certain programs and services being helpful to individuals and families. And when we go back to the idea that place-based initiatives are supposed to transform conditions for the larger community, and we try to look at the larger community as the level of analysis, sometimes we don't see as strong effects at that level. So we see it for specific individuals, families, and oftentimes it's harder to see it, at least at this time point, right, for the larger community. And I think it speaks to the fact that when we think about impact, we're looking at problems that have become instantiated over generations. And sometimes I don't think we have realistic expectations around how quickly those changes what would happen, right? Or those improvements or outcomes. So I think we have to take a long-term approach. There are some immediate outcomes that we can look at, and we can see important changes like around mental health, graduation rates. And then there's certain long-term outcomes, impacts that we have to measure over time. And so I think we have to balance those two when we're looking at outcomes. The other tension that I see is, I guess, this distinction between, I'll say, top-down measurement and bottom-up measurement. And what I mean by that is, often, we have funders who would like to see certain things, right? And have certain outcomes in mind. And we have certain outcomes in mind as well. And I think those are important. But we also have to keep in mind how the community itself is defining what well-being is for them. And how do we get at those things? How do we measure those things that are of importance to the community? And sometimes it gets at the touchy-feely things that Mark referenced. And I think researchers can play a huge role, particularly using community-based participatory research, where you can get community members involved in formulating the research questions, coming up with research design and picking indicators that are of importance to them as well. So you can merge the interest in some of these structural indicators that help to drive these efforts with also what may be these other outcomes that are also of interest and importance to people who are living there.
Right.
Laura, if I could just jump in real quick, because I want to set up Dr. Chetty when he comes to town.
Okay.
His research and this research of his team is saying the touchy-feely things connect to economic mobility. So that's no longer us, right? That is with billions of data points, who you know, and if you overcome this friending bias, translates to economic mobility. So we have that coming out of research, no longer just out of us kind of arguing for community building.
Right. Excellent. All right. Well, there are so many questions that we have bubbling from both registration, from the chat right now. I think in our minds, I know that there's been a little bit of a chat going on and some of those questions being answered, but I'm going to pull a few of them. And what I'd like to do for the panel, I know I want us to end with just a quick round of solutions, 1 to 2 key solutions that everybody does kind of rapid fire. But let's take a few questions from the audience before that, and then I will close this out. And I'm going to start with one that might pull in a little bit of that kind of touchy-feely, the potential for touchy-feely over food. Food always connects people, and Tom Hanchin asked, Julie particularly, are the food trucks that regularly come to Bright Walk part of a bridging strategy? And what would you say about that?
Yeah, and what I said was it is community driven, but it isn't DreamKey. There does come a point where DreamKey, as an affordable housing developer, has turned over the power to residents in those neighborhoods. And it was something that they wanted to see. And so they brought it into their community. They made it a priority. They reached out to some of the food truck vendors, and they got what they wanted. So, I mean, it's community-driven strategy.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry I missed your response in the chat. I was listening.
That's okay.
I was listening too intently. So we have a couple of questions here around East Charlotte. And one is from Charlotte East, a neighborhood group in Charlotte. How do we work with local government to avoid changing a middle-income community to a low-income community because land is less expensive and more housing can be built? This is getting more toward that kind of those kind of structural decisions, but what would you say, and who would like to answer that?
I'll take a crack at it, because one of the things that I was thinking on that question was that I'm usually trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to keep a moderate income, traditionally African-American neighborhood from gentrifying and from becoming a higher income neighborhood. So I hadn't really thought about kind of a middle income neighborhood becoming a low income neighborhood in Charlotte. That just isn't really happening because the whole community is gentrifying to some degree. I don't see it. But I do think that there was a response about East Charlotte that said, you know, high quality affordable housing is completely different than what people think of as affordable housing. Often people see an older apartment community that, you know, has naturally occurring lower rents, and they think it's affordable housing, or what we call affordable housing. And it isn't necessarily. It's probably investor owned and just hasn't been taken care of. So it's not something that I have experienced. And I've been at this one for I'm not even going to say how many years, Lori.
You have lots of experience.
Yeah.
I had a similar reaction to Julie's in terms of government, obviously UDO and ordinances and zoning. All of those are mechanisms by which cities use those tools to influence housing development. Selfishly, I guess, similar to Julie, is that the affordable housing piece is what is difficult to have developed in communities. The market rate housing is going to happen, and that's going to happen without anyone's control. Because if you are a private developer and you can acquire the property, you can build. There are homes in Greer Heights. I mentioned earlier, the median income for persons in Greer Heights is $18,000 or less. There are homes in Greer Heights that have sold for over $500,000. That's because private developers have come in and bought the land and built a house. Julie and I can't compete with the resources they have. And so mixed income communities are happening naturally, quote unquote, organically, to the extent that Julie and I are able to come in and build affordable housing because the market rate housing is going to come. So it was an interesting question because, like Julie, wasn't one that I really contemplated, just given the reality of what we're facing in the communities we're working.
Great. And I know that there are so many other questions. I see a question here that I really want us to, I don't want to say hold for February, but what I'm excited about is most of this panel is coming back in February for our Schul Forum. So I want to, there's a question here about corporate ownership and the impact of corporate ownership and kind of thinking about that in terms of mixed income communities. So I want to come back to that. There's some really good questions. I don't want to lose it, but I also think that's a bigger conversation. And I don't want to lessen it by trying to do it too fast. And so what I would really love to do to close is to have each of our, and I'll give you a nod, but have each of our panelists offer 1 to 2 key solutions, and particularly, I had framed this as particularly structural and policy solutions, but now that I've heard Mark talk about and everyone talk about the importance of these quote unquote softer solutions, what are those 1 to 2 key solutions for creating meaningful connections in our neighborhoods, in the spaces we live? So Tiffany, I'm going to start with you.
I'm smiling a little bit because I don't know. I don't know that I have a solution. What I'm intrigued by, honestly, is continuing to ask the question of what the solutions are, and beginning to borrow more from best practices in other communities. Charlotte has a tendency sometimes to believe it is best in class and that it knows everything, and I resist that thinking. And so some of the tools and resources that Mark referenced, I think, are important. I would say, as maybe not a solution, but certainly an effort on the part of CrossRoads, that we're constantly trying to bring all the voices together. We have probably dispelled this notion of singular community voice, and we try to work towards community consensus, trying to build coalition around community interests and what are the best ways to meet those interests, even if the one idea is not the idea. Like, what are we interested in having as an outcome, and what's the best way to get to that particular outcome?
Great, thank you. Andrew.
I think Tiffany stole my thunder there. I think that the more that you can have community engagement in the various facets of these efforts, that the better it'll be for a number of reasons. You have people with the lived experience on the ground who are giving valuable input and bringing their expertise to the table. So, however you can do that. And I'll speak specifically again for those of us in the academic community who may come in as researchers, to the degree to which we can do really truly community engaged work that involves members of the community in thinking through the important questions and how to go about trying to answer those questions through research. The more we can do that, I think the better off these efforts will be.
Great, thank you. Julie?
Yeah, I started thinking back to intentionality when you asked that question, because, we did have a Statesville Avenue corridor plan that was back in 2001, but we revisited it. And we revisited it with the neighborhood. And I can't tell you how important it is to have written goals for the community, to have organizations or people assigned to those goals, timelines, things that are written out, because otherwise, Charlotte's great at having plans that kind of sit on the shelves. But if it's a community-driven plan, and you've got a community quarterback, like a CrossRoads or somebody like that who is really working that plan, I think a lot can get done. And, put right in there community engagement. Put in there, we'll have an event once every month that really purposefully brings everybody together. Man, Mark, I immediately jumped on your circle meetings idea, because let me tell you, I can't tell you how many meetings I have been in at a community level that the same people talk every single time. And I just love that. It's like, okay, I'm immediately adopting it.
Great, thank you. Mark, a last word.
Yeah, and this really dovetails with what Julie just offered. There's got to be an explicit vision for inclusive, equitable communities. We can't just say mixed income. We can't just say affordable housing. We have to name it. And then we have to identify leadership at all levels who can lift that up, who really believes, who are the true believers in this.
Yeah.
And make sure that, as Julie said, the roles are then clear who's going to carry it out, and then be intentional in every single aspect of the initiative. Hiring, activities, design, meetings, events. Every activity is an opportunity to do this social bridging. And so maximize how we're doing that throughout the life of the initiative.
Thank you all so much for such an insightful conversation. And there were so many good questions from the audience during registration, today during the event. If we didn't get to your questions, know that we are using them to shape the remaining events in the series. We will be talking about religious organizations. We'll be talking about arts and culture. We'll come back to housing. But on that note, I really am excited to announce that Dr. Mark Joseph and many of our panelists today will be back on the afternoon of February 1st for our in-person Schul Forum. So definitely save that date. But in 2 weeks, please join us when we explore another connecting space, our arts and creative spaces. We will host Ushra Srinivasan, the president of Mosaic America, an organization based in San Jose, working with artists and culture bearers to craft a vision of a shared future. She will be joined by Priya Sarkar and Krista Terrell, two of our community leaders in the arts, and Dr. Von Schmutz, an associate professor of sociology and Gambrell faculty fellow. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Jose Gomez, the interim dean of College of Arts and Architecture. So register now, and we will see you in 2 weeks. And thank you, everyone, so much for your participation today.